Richard Engel, welcome to the show.
It is a pleasure to be here. I've not done this before. I've known you for years, but I've never done your show.
Well, it's about time, and I'm glad that we're doing it for a pretty important occasion. 20 years since the war in Iraq feels like not that long ago. You were there, and I want you to start by telling us just a little bit. You're a young freelance journalist in the Middle East.
Feels a long time ago.
And suddenly, like, how do you end up in Baghdad? Give us the story.
What happened was Saddam Hussein obviously was the entrenched dictator. It was very hard to get access to Iraq. And then as the war was approaching, it was getting more and more difficult because the Iraqi government wanted to allow in a certain number of journalists. And to their credit, they weren't picking and choosing which networks, and they weren't picking and choosing the names of reporters and correspondents. But what they were doing is limiting access. So each news organization, depending on its size, got one or two reporting teams. And as you rightfully said, I was a young, fresh-faced freelancer, didn't have any real deep established connections at major networks. But I did know the region. I had been already living in the region. I did know Iraq. I spoke Arabic. I'd been to Iraq before and felt that this was a tremendously important story. I thought it was going to be a turning point in the Middle East. So I ended up getting a human shield visa, to the long and the short of it is. Meaning I promised that I would be a human shield for Saddam Hussein. And he was giving out visas, or his government was giving out visas for this purpose, to get preferably Americans, but really anybody who would go there and say, don't fight, let me chain myself to a power plant or an airfield and be a peace activist. It was a way to get in, it was a way to get the visa, and then I once I was in the country, I never chained myself to anything.
How was it to be an American on the ground there as you're meeting with Iraqis, as the United States is bombing the country? What was your experience, and how different was it from what you might have expected when you showed up?
So when the war began, I was very nervous that when the first bombs started falling, I'd be ripped to shreds or arrested or something terrible would happen. It didn't happen that way. Instead, the government went underground. So a lot of the government officials who were assigned to watch me disappeared. It was not that good of a dictatorship. And the people who were regime loyalists kind of lost interest in that job too. So the fear that I had of the regime didn't materialize. The people were docile, pacified. They'd been beaten down by so many years of dictatorship. They didn't act. And they just kind of waited it out. And then when the invasion began, these people who'd been told their whole lives to be submissive didn't do anything. So I didn't have any hostility from the government because the government kind of was chasing its own tail at that stage. The people didn't react. And a lot of people were very happy, frankly, that the Americans were coming in and were getting rid of Saddam. The more it seemed like it was likely that the regime was losing its grip, the more people came out of their shadow to celebrate, to cheer, to help me find stories. And then when Saddam was actually driven from power and was on the run, there was a wonderful reception for about a year. And then it got very, very ugly because of mistakes that were made by the local American administration there, because of lingering resentment by the basically Sunni Muslim community that felt they were pushed out of power and now had no future. So the resentment began to settle in roughly a year into it. And then there was anger and animosity that made the place much more dangerous and changed the dynamic.
I mean, there was, of course, you're talking a little bit about how the attitude changed. And I remember, of course, when Vice President Cheney at the time said the Americans would be welcomed as liberators. Clearly, we saw those images of the statue of Saddam Hussein that was toppled and all of the people around that were...
I was standing under that
jumping.
statue. It almost fell on me. I was on a balcony. Some of those pictures you saw, I took with my own little handy camera. I was right there and watched it happen. They were cheering and they were excited. And it lasted a little while. It did last a little while. But then when things didn't get better and the power didn't get put back on, and the promises that they were expecting, even if they weren't explicitly made, failed to materialize, and people who were not included and felt they had no path. The Bush administration was calling them dead enders. Well, dead enders, that's a problem. When you have someone who's a dead ender, that means they're desperate and they got no place to go and they're angry and it's their country and they know it better than you do.
What lessons, if any, did you learn from the war in Iraq that you would apply to what we see on the ground in Ukraine today?
Don't do a war of choice. War truly must be the last resort. Iraq was a war of choice, and it was perceived to be a reality because certain intelligence had been cherry-picked and the Bush administration believed it was some kind of reality, but it was a war of choice, and many within the administration, many of the intelligence agencies knew that. And for Russia, Ukraine is a war of choice, although many in Russia don't believe that. And certainly Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that. He believes it's an existential crisis. And I think over time, if you launch a war of choice, you're going to have problems. You're going to run into people who feel that you don't have the right to determine what happens in their homeland. And that happened in Iraq, and I think that's happening in Ukraine. So I think that's one lesson. The other lesson is how different they are. Iraq it started out as a traditional war. The United States military in uniforms went in, eliminated the Saddam government, 21 days marching up from the south to reach Baghdad. And then it became a more typical Middle Eastern war. Sunni versus Shia, Shia versus the United States, Kurds versus Arab, Arab versus Persian. So many different layers to it that needed to be explained. In Ukraine, you have both sides in uniform, trenches in between them, and a very clear narrative. One country is trying to take over and occupy the other one in flat terrain using tanks and artillery.
So get back to Iraq for a second. 20 years later, how are the Iraqi people doing? I mean, to what extent can you talk about better off, worse off trajectory as a consequence of the country that has been so much, for good and for bad, shaped by the United States of America?
I wish there was an easy answer saying they're better off, they're worse off. The people are freer. The economy is connected to the world. People who lived under Saddam's Iraq were not free in any possible way of imagining. The children were reporting on their adults if they spoke about any kind of perceived seditious activity. You couldn't go anywhere. The best you could hope for was to be left alone. And that wasn't even easy. So you had to toe the line and go out of your way to be left alone. And there were drafts. 1 million people were killed in the Iran-Iraq war, more or less for nothing. So it was a very dangerous place to live and a horrible place to live if you were an Iraqi. Then the Americans came and they gave them freedom, but they unleashed a civil war. So that was also horrible to go through, because what's the joy in being able to say what you want if somebody's going to come and cut your head off? And that happened a lot. There were assassination squads going around, killing Sunnis, killing Shias, and Shia killing Sunnis, and vice versa. And now the country is starting to emerge, but isn't quite accepted in the larger Middle East yet. So I don't think I don't think they've landed yet. The country's much safer. They are much freer. So they're better than they were under the Civil War. They're better than they were under Saddam. But they haven't been embraced as a fully functioning country yet. They are still half Iran, half Arab world, half corrupt, half semi-functional.
Richard Engel, thanks for sharing that.
My pleasure. Thank you.